I have read the war records of 940 candidates in my years at the Reckoning Hall, and I remember exactly 9 of them. The human woman is the 10th, and she is the only one whose record I could not finish reading aloud, because the hall would not let me. The hall went silent the way a room goes silent when someone dies in it, that whole-body hush, that held breath of stone and glass and old warriors. And I stood at the glass with my mouth open and no sound coming out, and I understood, too late and all at once, that we had been fools for a very long time. Let me tell it the way it happened, from the beginning when she was nothing to me. The Saravanth War Lyceum sits on the shoulder of a dead mountain, above a sea that has not moved in an age because the cold holds it. We are the oldest martial school in the Concord. Before there was a Concord, there was the Lyceum, and the 8 founding peoples sent their best to us to be measured, and we measured them, and we have gone on measuring for 11,000 years. That is not a boast. It is the reason the thing I am about to tell you matters. We do not impress. We are the ones who cannot be impressed. That is the whole of our authority. A cadet who passes the Lyceum's reckoning is a soldier no army questions again. I was 3rd proctor of the Reckoning Hall. My name is Oren Vash of the Sethuli, and I had held the post long enough to have stopped hopping to be surprised. That is the honest truth of a proctor's life. You stand at the glass. You call the candidate forward. You watch their war history rise in the light, every engagement they have ever survived, drawn true and unhideable from the marrow of them, and you tally it against the standard, and you name them fit or unfit, and the next one steps up. 940 times. You learn to read a soldier in the first 3 battles the glass shows you. You learn to know the shape of a life at war before it has finished unspooling. And you learn above all that most lives at war are small. Even good soldiers, even brave ones. A handful of skirmishes, one campaign that nearly broke them, a wound that taught them fear. That is a full soldier's record. That is what the glass usually shows. So when the humans applied to send a candidate to the Lyceum, I did not think about it much. None of us did. The humans were new. That was the word we used for them, though it was not fair. They were not young. They were only new to us, which is a different thing, and I know that now. They had come into the Concord's Edge some 60 years before, a loud little species from a single scarred world, and they had done the thing new peoples do. They had asked to be taken seriously before they had earned it. They sent envoys who talked too much. They fought their small wars on their small frontier and called them great. The elder peoples smiled at them the way you smile at a child who has strapped on his father's blade and announced he will defend the house. Nobody expected the child to defend anything. Nobody expected the human they sent to us to pass. We admitted her out of courtesy, and courtesy alone. The Concord asks the Lyceum to be gracious to its newest members, and we are gracious. We let her come and be measured, so that when she failed, the humans could say they had at least stood at the glass. I want you to understand that clearly because it is the shame of it. We brought her in to fail with dignity. We had already written the ending. We only needed her to stand still while we read it out. Her name was Cora Vane. She arrived on the last transport before the passes froze, in a coat that was not warm enough for our mountain, carrying 1 bag. That was the first thing the other proctors laughed about, quietly, in the way we are not supposed to. 1 bag. The Kale candidate that season had come with an honor guard of 40 and a case of ceremonial armor that took 6 of them to lift. The Voron boy had brought his family's war standard, a thing of woven metal 3,000 years old, and had it hung in the entrance hall so that everyone who passed would know his line. Cora Vane came with 1 bag and a coat that was too thin, and she stood in the entrance hall under the Voron standard and looked at it for a while with an expression I could not read, and then she went and found her cell and did not come out until she was called. She was not young for a human, which meant she was old for a soldier. There was gray coming into her dark hair at the temples, and her face had the weathered, settled look of someone who has been outdoors in hard places for most of a life. She was not large. Humans are not large. She moved quietly. She did not talk too much, which surprised me, because I had been told all humans talk too much, and I had believed it, because it is easier to believe a thing about a whole people than to look at one of them. She kept to herself in the weeks before the reckoning. The other candidates trained in the yards where they could be seen. She trained alone before dawn in the lower court where the old snow never melts, and I know this only because I keep a proctor's hours, and I saw her there once through a high window, moving through forms I did not recognize, slow, economical, joyless. Not the flashing forms the young ones practice to be watched. Something older. Something you do to stay alive rather than to be admired. I watched her for a while and thought, she is going through the motions of a soldier she used to be. I thought it kindly, almost pityingly. I thought she was clinging to a self that the glass would soon expose as ordinary. I have been wrong in my life. I have never been as wrong as I was about Cora Vane. The reckoning is held in winter always, so that the candidates come to the glass cold and stripped of comfort. The hall is the oldest room in the Lyceum, a vault of black stone with the glass at its heart, not glass as you would think of it, but a standing sheet of something the founders made and we can no longer make, that draws the truth of a war life out of the one who stands before it and shows it in light for all to see. You cannot lie to the glass. You cannot inflate a skirmish into a battle or hide a cowardice. It reads what your body knows, what your nerves remember, what is written into you below the place where words are. It shows your wars as they were. It is the reason no one questions a Lyceum soldier. The glass does not flatter and it does not forgive. The masters sit in the high tiers when a reckoning is held, the Lyceum's oldest warriors, the ones who have nothing left to prove and so have earned the right to judge. The first master that season was Vale Asan of the Thren, who was 400 years old and had commanded fleets in the Sundering, and who had not risen from his seat for any candidate in living memory. He sat above the glass with his eyes half closed, the way the very old sit, present and absent at once. I remember thinking, as I called the order of candidates, that he would sleep through the humans' reckoning, that there would be nothing in it to wake him. She was to go last. We put her last on purpose, the courtesy failure at the end of the day when the masters were tired and the real candidates had already been measured and passed. A quiet ending, a door closing softly. The others went as I expected. The Kale candidate had a strong record, 4 campaigns, a defense of a moon that cost him half his hand. The glass showed it true, and the masters nodded and he passed. The Voron boy with the 3,000-year standard had less than his standard suggested, 2 engagements, both won with numbers on his side, and the glass showed that too, the thinness under the pride of it, and he passed, but the masters did not nod, and he went out knowing what the hall now knew about him, which is its own kind of measuring. That is what the glass does. It shows you as you are. Most candidates leave a little smaller than they came, because most of us are a little smaller than we hope. Then the hall was near empty, and the light was going gray through the high slits, and I called the last name. Cora Vane of the humans stepped to the glass. She stood up from the low bench where she had waited all day without moving much, and she crossed the black stone floor in her too thin coat, and she stood before the glass the way she stood everywhere, quietly, squarely, without display. She did not look up at the masters. She looked at the glass, and I saw in the gray light that her hands at her sides were not quite steady, and I mistook it. I thought, she is afraid, and she should be, because in a moment we will all see how little she is. I felt something almost like pity. I was ready to read out a short record in a gentle voice and send her home with her dignity, and I had the gentle voice ready in my throat. I raised my hand to the glass. I spoke the words that begin a reckoning, show her wars. And the glass woke. The first thing it showed was a world burning. I have seen the glass show burning worlds. It shows them small, usually and far, a candidate remembering a planet they lost, seen from orbit, a private grief drawn thin. This was not small and it was not far. This filled the hall. The light of it climbed the black walls and threw the masters' faces into hard relief, and it was not a memory seen from orbit. It was a memory seen from the ground, from inside it. The glass showed a sky the color of a wound and ash falling like snow, and a line of human soldiers dug into a ridge with the fire coming up the slope toward them. And it showed her among them, younger, but her, unmistakably her, the same square quiet. And it showed that the line was very thin and the fire was very wide, and it showed that they held. The hall did not react at first. One battle, even a terrible one. A soldier may have one terrible battle in them. The glass moved on. It does not linger. It tells a war life at the pace the body lived it, and hers went fast because there was so much of it. It showed a second engagement, a third, a crossing of a frozen river under fire, the ice breaking, soldiers going under her, pulling one out of the black water and losing two more doing it. A city fought street by street for 11 days, the glass showing the 11 days as a smear of exhausted violence and her somewhere in all of it not resting. A retreat through a forest that was on fire, a stand at a bridge, another stand at a gate, another. The engagements came and did not stop coming, and I stood there with my hands still raised and my gentle voice forgotten in my throat, and I began, slowly, to be afraid. You must understand, a proctor tallies. It is what my hand does even when my mind has stopped, and my hand had lost count. By the place where a strong candidate's record ends, 4 campaigns, the defense of a wound that taught fear, she was still in what the glass was showing as the early part of her life, the part before it got hard. I heard, behind and above me, the sound of the masters beginning to sit forward. The glass showed a war. Not a battle, a war. It drew back, the way it almost never does, and showed the shape of a whole war at once, the way you might see a river's whole length from a great height, and I saw that it was a war humanity had fought alone. There were no allies in it, no conquered ships in that black sky. Just the one scarred world and its ships and its soldiers against something that came out of the dark to end them, something vast and patient and without number, and I understood, watching the shape of it, that this was a war humanity had been losing. That should have been losing. That any of the elder peoples, measured against that enemy and that arithmetic, would have lost. We would have lost. I say that as a proctor of the Saravanth War Lyceum, and I say it knowing what it costs my pride. Show the Thren or the Kale or my own Sethuli that war, with those numbers and no allies and one world to stand on, and we would have negotiated our surrender and called it wisdom. The humans did not surrender. The glass showed why. The glass showed her. It came down out of the great shape of the war and into her again, into the ground again, and it showed the thing they call, I learned the name only later when I could bear to ask, the break. The place and the day where the war was decided, where the enemy came through the last line and there was nothing behind that line but the world itself, all of it, everyone, and the line was going to fail, and someone had to hold the failing place long enough for the rest to matter. The glass showed who held it. It showed a smaller group than there should have been, in a broken position that could not be held, holding it anyway for an hour, and then past the hour, past the place where holding was possible, into the place where holding is only a word for dying slowly on purpose. And it showed her at the center of it, giving the orders, and then when the orders ran out, standing in the line herself, and then when the line was down to almost nothing, being the line. Glass slowed. It does that only for the thing that most made a soldier what they are. It slowed on her face in that hour, gray with ash, past exhaustion, past fear, into the terrible clear place beyond fear, and it showed that she knew she was going to die there and had decided it was acceptable, and that this decision was not despair. It was arithmetic. She had weighed her one life against the world behind her and found the trade good and made it, without drama, the way she did everything, and gone on holding. And they held. The glass showed that they held, long enough. The world behind them lived because the failing place did not fail while she was standing in it. And it did not fail while she was standing in it because she would not let it. And the glass showed the exact moment the tide turned somewhere far off, and the enemy's great number began, at last, to break against a thing it had not counted on, which was that these small new creatures would simply not stop, would stand in the fire past all reason, would spend themselves entirely and call it a fair price. It showed her still on her feet at the end of it, barely, held up more by the dead around her than by her own legs, and it showed that she lived. Somehow. That she was one of the few from the failing place who walked out of it. And then the glass showed the years after. The other wars. Because there were other wars after that one, smaller, the frontier skirmishes we had smiled at, and I understood now that we had smiled at a woman who had held the brake, telling her small wars was a courtesy she had never once claimed for herself. She had never told us any of this. It was not in the papers the humans sent. She had come with one bag and a coat too thin, and stood under the Voron boy's 3,000-year standard, and looked at it with an expression I could not read. And I understood the expression now, and it shamed me to my roots. The glass finished. The light of her wars sank back down into it, and the hall was gray again, and cold and utterly, completely silent. I did not read the tally. I could not. There was no tally. The standard we measure against the 4 campaigns, the defense of a moon, the wound that teaches fear. The standard was so far below what the glass had shown that to speak it would have been an obscenity. It would have been measuring an ocean with a cup and announcing the cup was full. My hand was still raised. I lowered it. I looked up at the masters, because a proctor looks to the masters for the verdict, and the verdict is spoken by the first master. And I waited for Vale Asan of the Thren, 400 years old, commander of fleets in the Sundering, who had not risen from his seat for any candidate in living memory, to speak the word that would end her reckoning. He was standing. I do not know when he had risen. None of us had seen it, because none of us had been able to look away from the glass. But he was standing, the oldest and hardest of us, on his feet in the high tier with his hands on the rail, and he was looking down at the human woman in her too thin coat with an expression I had never seen on a master's face in all my years in the hall. It was not approval. Approval is a small thing, and this was not small. It was the look of a man who has spent his whole long life certain of the size of the world, and has just discovered the world is larger. The other masters were rising too. One by one, the way old men rise, slowly with effort, they came to their feet in the high tiers of the reckoning hall, the masters of the Saravanth War Lyceum, the ones who cannot be impressed, whose whole authority is that they cannot be impressed, and they stood for her. And it was the most terrible and beautiful thing I have ever seen, because I knew what it cost each of them, and I knew none of them had decided to do it. Their bodies had decided. The way you stand when the truth walks into the room. Cora Vane did not seem to understand what was happening. She looked up finally from the glass to the standing masters, and her steady soldier's face broke a little into confusion, and she glanced at me as if to ask whether she had done something wrong, whether standing was a rebuke. And I could not answer her because I still could not speak. My throat had the gentle voice in it, the one I had readied to send her home with dignity, and it was useless now. It was ash, and I let it go. It was Vale Asan who broke the silence, 400 years old. His voice was not loud. The hall was so silent that it did not need to be. He said, "There is no rank in this lyceum high enough to grant you." That was all. That was the whole of the verdict. He did not say fit. He did not say past. Fit and past are words for us, for the ones who come to be measured against a standard, and she had not been measured against a standard because the standard did not reach her. He told the truth instead, which is the only thing the reckoning hall is truly for. There was no rank in the Lyceum high enough. The Lyceum had spent 11,000 years learning to measure warriors, and a human in a thin coat had walked in and stood at the far end of everything we knew how to measure, past the last mark on the rule, out where we had never had cause to draw a line because we had never believed anyone would go there. And then the first master of the Saravanth War Lyceum, who had not bowed to a living soul in 400 years, inclined his head to her. Not deeply. He was too old and too proud for a deep bow, and she would not have wanted one. I understand her well enough now to know that. But he inclined his head, the small grave gesture one warrior gives another whose war he could not have survived. And one by one, in the cold gray hall, the masters did the same. She stood there and let them because she did not know what else to do, and after a moment, and this is the part I remember most, the part I carry, she inclined her head back. To them. The same small measure. Warrior to warrior. She did not take the bow as tribute. She returned it as courtesy, as if they were all simply soldiers who had seen each other's wars and knew what such things cost, which is exactly what they were, and exactly what she had understood before any of us did. That was why she had never spoken of the break. Not modesty, something harder and cleaner than modesty. She did not think surviving it made her large. She thought it made her a soldier, which she had always been, and soldiers do not announce their wars. They carry them and are quiet. I have thought about her every winter since. When the passes freeze and the new candidates come with their honor guards and their ancestral standards and their 4 good campaigns, I stand at the glass and I raise my hand and I say, show their wars. And I watch the small, brave, ordinary lives rise up in the light, and I do not smile at them the way I used to. I do not smile at the new peoples anymore. The loud young ones from single scarred worlds who ask to be taken seriously before we think they have earned it. Because I stood at the glass once with a gentle voice ready in my throat, certain I knew the size of a person by the size of their bag and the thinness of their coat, and the glass showed me a world burning and a woman who held the failing place with her own body and called the trade fair, and it showed me, too, what a fool looks like from the inside, which is a thing the glass rarely bothers to show, and I am grateful and ashamed that it showed me. She left before the thaw. She did not stay to be given the honors the Lyceum wanted to give her. Because there were no honors high enough and she had no use for the low ones. She took her one bag and her thin coat and went back down the mountain to whatever small wars still needed a soldier, and the Lyceum has not been the same since, and neither have I. They struck her reckoning from the ordinary records. It sits now in a place of its own, the only record the Saravanth War Lyceum keeps that is not a measure of a candidate against the standard, but a measure of the standard against a candidate, a mark on the far wall of everything we know, out past the last line, where a human once stood and made us understand, all at once and too late, that we had been measuring the wrong thing for 11,000 years. We had been measuring how much war a soldier had survived. She taught us the other measure, the one the glass had always been able to show and we had never needed until she walked in. Not how much a soldier survives. What a soldier is willing to stand in and not step back from, when stepping back would be the reasonable thing, and the world is behind them and no one is coming. The Academy has never been speechless before or since. I was there. I held my hand up to the glass and I could not lower it and I could not speak, and above me 400 years of certainty rose slowly to its feet in the cold. I remember all of it. I remember her inclining her head back at us, warrior to warrior, courteous, quiet, already thinking about the next thing that needed holding. I remember thinking, in the silence, that I had spent my whole life at the glass learning to read a soldier in the first 3 battles, and that I had never in all those years read one all the way to the end.